Yo, what's up, mi gente? It's your boy Marco Rojas here for another episode of Aquí Estamos. I just want to wish everyone out there listening a happy new year. I know we passed Christmas this past week, but I hope everyone enjoyed their time with their familia, enjoyed their tamales, their atole, pozole, all that stuff, and whatever they were eating for Christmas and Christmas Eve. But today we have an episode, a special episode. I know last week we've been hit with new stuff hitting with us in current events. Two of the biggest things I thought I wanted to talk about in this episode was Governor Newsom appointing Alex Padilla, the first Latino, to represent the Senate here in California. And then also talking about Miguel Cardona, who is a choice for Joe Biden in his administration for Secretary of Education, what that actually looks like, especially for somebody like myself as a teacher. What does a Secretary of Education do? So on and so forth. So come check us out. Aquí estamos para que todos sepan. You know, Alex Padilla's story isn't really unique to me. You know, his story resembles millions of Latinos here in the United States that essentially had family come here from a different country and work hard to accomplish what he was able to accomplish. That's for sure. I think his story even resembles mine as well because I feel that when I was doing a little research on him, feeling reading that he was able to come to school here in the United States. Both his parents immigrated from Mexico. It really connected with me. We both being first American or first generation Mexicans, and the idea that hard work can be accomplished, with the resources there. He grew up in Los Angeles, tough area to grow up in. The resources aren't vast over there, especially in areas that are low poverty or in high poverty areas. Grades that helped him get into schools like MIT. And it's crazy to hear about this guy because, a Secretary of State, a politician, to get an MIT and get a degree in engineering, like it's not even an easy task. So we know that the man is intelligent, the man is educated. He has the knowledge to basically make wise decisions, and as a man graduating from MIT and in engineering, he had no desire to get in politics. But just like him, many other Latinos, I don't know if you guys ever heard of, he ran for Senate in 2016 or 2018, I apologize. His name is Kevin De Leon. They got involved in politics here in California when the Proposition 187 came to fruition, where it was excluding illegal immigrants here in California from public assistance, even public education. So at the time, very conservative, California was very conservative and they were doing everything they can. And obviously it was a tactic that was really charged to target Latinos, those that came from, obviously Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, all these different countries that are Spanish speaking. And this was a target to them. And this is what motivated Alex Padilla to get involved into politics. But he didn't run right away. He basically campaigned and he worked with different politicians today that are still involved, such as Dianne Feinstein and other Latino politicians like Tony Cardenas, Gil Cedillo, Richard Alarcon, like all these representatives and state senators that represented California in the 90s. And it wasn't until probably in the late 1900 or 1999, he was representing Los Angeles in the city council. So he was involved in these politics, but in big cities as well. So his track record with big cities is known as well. He eventually becomes Secretary of State in 2014. and does a lot of work for Secretary of State. Basically, what I talk about was he made it easier for Californians to vote. I think that's just one of the hugest things that a Secretary of State needs to do. Not requiring voter ID laws, because we know historically how that disenfranchises communities of color. And that was a huge thing. And I even think this was a huge thing as well, providing legislation and all that for 16 to 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. As a teacher, I got seniors. So I basically talk about how important it is to vote and starting them off early so they have some knowledge of what it looks like, and basically providing ballots to active or pre-registered voters so that they can see what's going on. And also this year, what he was able to do and accomplish in the primaries to bump up California so that our voices can be heard during the Democratic primaries and even the Republican primaries to be heard. So he's been in the forefront providing things for a Secretary of State, making sure our voices are heard collectively to make it a true democracy. His connections with Governor Newsom dates back to the 2000s, so you knew that was an ally of his. And he understood how important the Latino voice and the Latino representation in the Senate is huge for our state. I can't continue to explain and regurgitate the same things I've been saying, how important it is to have a Latino voice when it comes to legislation, when it comes to representation, especially during our times when, as a country, we're fighting for our own civil rights. People think that our civil rights was in the 60s and the 70s. We fought for it and we have them right away, but we're in the 2020s now, and we're seeing that decades later, we're still fighting for our rights. And the fact that we have Latino representation here in the Senate, I think, is a huge thing. Other community leaders, our comunidades that we're fighting to essentially represent our values and our customs, and showing how much of an impact we have in our nation. When we think about Latinos in the Senate, it's very little. I think there's like maybe 2, 3. I mean, I can't give you the exact number from the top of my head, but it's very low. Because on the other side, we have, our white counterparts that, represent 90+% of the Senate. And we don't realize how important the Senate is, because one of the primary roles is to pass the legislation. We don't realize that lack of representation in these primaries to vote for senators, so on and so forth, really hurts us in the long run. But as we have Alex Padilla here representing our, nuestra gente here in the Senate, we have to just be grateful and thankful, but keep fighting for our people, to keep fighting for their civil rights. It doesn't get any easier from here. It doesn't mean that we've accomplished what we've accomplished and we can let go. No. What this means is, yes, we have a Latino representing our state of California as a senator, the first time ever in our history. But it means that the fight continues and that we continue to represent our people, nuestras comunidades, so on and so forth. I just want to talk about Joe Biden's choice, Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. He's a Puerto Rican, a Latino from Connecticut. I actually love his story because he grew up in the housing projects in Connecticut, and, he went to school, did well, and ended up going back to teach at the school district that he grew up in. So I thought that was huge, because I give props to anybody that grows up in a tough environment and goes back, or gets educated. And, people tend not to go back, but he goes back and gives back to his community. So that's major props to that. And it's crazy because, he becomes a 4th grade teacher, and then at the age of 28, he becomes the school principal. He becomes a principal at 28 years old, which I think that's crazy, man. That's young, because that's like me becoming a principal next year, which, it's tough, that's for sure their responsibilities. But he's definitely known for his work in the community, especially during this global pandemic, how he was able to give resources to the students so that they can go to remote learning. But he's been at odds with, teacher unions as well, because he's been pushing back to get students back on campus. He wants to fight to he wants to make sure students are being educated and in the environment to do so, but he also knows that their health matters as well. So, even though he's been at odds with teacher unions, he still is represented by many teacher unions support him as well. But I think it's really interesting because we don't hear much about what a secretary of education does. What does a Latino in the secretary of education, as a secretary of education, what does that have an impact on? I think it's great. I think it's a great choice, especially the fact that we are breaking away ties from Betsy DeVos, providing education to the privileged few and focusing on public education and how to better public education as well. So that's a huge thing. But he's saying, he's focusing on Title I funding, making sure that giving money to the neediest schools and from the lowest economic backgrounds, that's one of his major focuses, because, schools that are low income, they don't have as much resources for that. But we know that that's one of his biggest pushes. So it's going to be interesting to learn more about him. There's very little resources out there that really talks about him, but to listen to what he's been able to do during this global pandemic is pretty huge as well. So we're going to see how big the Secretary of Education, what that has in our educational system for sure. First off, I just want to talk about that a Secretary of Education doesn't control everything. They're like facilitators. They make sure that there is an agenda and they push forward with it. But as anything else, they don't control what principals or state policies gives it to them. They basically allocate funding. They oversee educational funding, right? Head Start, Title I grants, making sure that low-income students have a opportunity to get equitable education. They also administer Pell Grants. So Pell Grants help pays for colleges, especially for those that are low and middle income students. So they basically allocate these funds for these students as well. They make sure that they oversee regarding civil rights, making sure that students aren't discriminated based on their sex, based on their race, based on their national origin, disability, so on and so forth. They make sure that every student has the opportunity to receive this education and not be discriminated as well. And I think that that's a huge impact, but let's not get carried away and think that they can create policies and we all abide by them. No, we have states that have policies already set in place. They basically facilitate and are there to make sure that what the role of the federal government is trying to do regarding education. So this is going to be interesting to see a Latino now out, from a low income area that was raised in Connecticut in the projects, right? And the fact that now he's become Secretary of Education, or a choice of Secretary of Education, is huge, because now we see Latinos taking power. And I feel like moving forward, two individuals that have a huge say on federal policies that are going to represent nuestra gente, we have to hold them accountable as well. I was speaking to my wife, and these conversations are always had where, okay, just because they're Latino, that means that they're going to represent us to our full capabilities. Well, actually, that's not always true, right? I think sometimes that we need to understand, like, let's get out of this fairy tale that every politician is going to represent our best interests, especially if they come from the same background. I think essentially what's the most important thing is always holding accountable our representatives to the highest of capabilities, because when we do that, that's how we ensure that every voice, from voting to policies that are being created, to our education, to our kids, to the teachers, that resources they can give to their students to provide them the best education, this is where it comes down to. So it's important. Now, I'm proud that Latinos are taking power. That's the point of this episode. But let's not get carried away and think this is where it ends. Let's continue to fight for nuestra gente y también nuestras comunidades. just want to thank everyone that took the time to listen to today's episode of Aquí Estamos, Latinos Take Power. If you haven't had a chance, go ahead and follow us on Instagram at Aquí Estamos Podcast, as well as following us on Spotify and Apple Podcast, Aquí Estamos con Marco Rojas. And you can also subscribe to us at Aquí Estamos Podcast on YouTube. Much love, y'all. Aquí estamos para que todos sepan.